people are familiar with Trend Micro as one of the world's premier security vendors. His comments today are going to talk a little bit about Trend Micro's strategy, but very focused on how their solutions work in the broader health and life sciences environment. All yours, Zach.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron. So as Ron mentioned, my name is Zach Milam. I am a cloud solution architect at Trend Micro and have been doing a lot of stuff in the cloud digital transformation space for a number of years, but also in the healthcare space as well. I've been focused in that in a couple different roles at Trend. So as we go through today, I want to focus on a few things. So medical devices, third-party pieces, how that relates to HIPAA, PHI, all those kinds of pieces that are there, and some overall strategies, and then some of the solutions that we have, right? So Trend Micro offers a lot of security solutions. We've been around for over 30 years. We do a lot of innovative things, but there are some things that, just an overall strategy can approach it that you may not need technology for. And I want to discuss some of those and pieces we've seen. So with that, I want to start with this, and I've converted this slide over a little bit, and I'm not going to show it where it goes on to different areas because we're talking about a bunch of different things here. So whether we're talking about, all those different clouds and providers and different places that your information might be, or we're talking IoT, third-party devices, the security itself is kind of a different continuum. So it could be down here, or it could be moved up here, depending on where you're at and who you're doing anything with. This is a moving target. Now, as you start to do things like platforms and things like that, then more of that responsibility shifts over to that vendor. But with that being said, you have to make sure that those are responsible vendors and who's actually developing and you're getting devices from and all those things that are there. And we're going to go over that here in just a second. So when we think about putting in the third-party medical devices and IoT and all those things, some of the concerns that I hear from my customers on a regular basis are things like that they can't be updated, they can't put things on there. These are more the devices that are actually in the facilities as opposed to, say, like the mobile devices that they were just talking about. But as we bring in more IoT, more smart care for our patients and all those things that happen, there's a lot of other things that start going in. And so it's not just, hey, regular IT operations and the things that we got to be cognizant of and what's there. And these first few slides, just so you know, this is coming from a white paper and research study that one of the divisions within Trend called our forward-looking threat research did specifically for healthcare. And I do have the links to that at the end of this. So if you want to take in and look at that, you'll be able to look at it much more in depth. But they really identified 3 areas. So patient health, data privacy, and then of course the hospital operations. A lot of people think about things being attacked and might happen is really more the hospital operations. But as more and more things go online and make it more efficient and trying to bring down costs and do things like having the right things at the right time, so whether that's pharmaceuticals or it's the right air gas mix or temperatures and all those things being shifted, all that stuff now can become a target of bad actors, right? At the same time, we have all the data privacy, making sure that it's not just your patient data, employee data, payroll, if you're doing any kind of research and drug trial, that data. And then the actual, the medical equipment, the hospital information systems, whether it's you're hosting it yourself, or using a SaaS-based solution for that. There's all these different things that are happening, and all those can be different areas that you have to worry about. And today I want to kind of look at it from a different view. So usually when a security vendor talks about things, they're talking about it inside your network. And I just want to bring to light and maybe shine a little bit of a focus on, some of this, especially as more and more things are purchased and get brought in. All of those things are now part of those different supply chains. A lot of them are IoT enabled. they have technology, all those pieces that are there. And so there becomes a lot of different points that you need to look at and consider when you start to bring on and integrate those pieces into an environment. And so with that being, all the way from, the actual software development of the core operating systems of those devices, all the way through the regular just application or firmware, making sure that that can be updated, and then making sure that the actual business processes, so the integrity of who's working, insider threats, phishing is still, in today, in 2020, a very, very, very high percentage in a lot of organizations, 90% plus, we are still looking at targeted email campaigns as the #1 way that bad actors get into environments, right? So those are critical. And usually when that happens, they get in and they're already inside the network. They're getting onto a device that either has access, maybe it has VPN, all those things that are happening, they get directly in and can get access to all those things that we really care about that we talked about on the last slide. So what can you do? And these are some high-level strategies. These are what my threat research team has said and kind of identified, and some of these are things that, like, BYOD, it's really hard to keep that from happening these days. But, making sure that there's bare minimums of what version of the operating system that those might be able to have, or are they patched, whether that's laptops or even, iOS or Android devices, having those types of things set up on your network. Making sure that, who you're getting your medical devices, it's not just the efficacy of the health pieces that they do, but what kind of security testing do they have, and the controls around their design and manufacture from the electronic side of it, making sure that there's no places that things could be introduced during those processes, right? The other huge piece that we see, and it is a challenge in a lot of healthcare environments, is around patching and updating. And whether that is actual hospital-owned devices, or that there may not be connected all the time, they might be air-gapped for other reasons, because maybe they're connected directly to a third-party device, and you want to not have that tied directly into the network, and people are moving things back and over. Or it could be actual third-party devices. And so whether that's firmware, what's implanted, that's a little bit more far-reaching. Again, I said it's a forward-looking threat research piece here, but those are things that are concerns that you need to make sure that all of those pieces, as you're making those decisions to bring those in, are being addressed. And the other big thing is you kind of have to switch into a mode of when you're going to go in there, that things need to be scanned, they need to be looked at from a vulnerability standpoint, and actually try to see, like, how secure are they. So sometimes that might be having to upskill some people within the IT organization. It might be third party coming in and doing those actual assessments of those devices. But I strongly encourage, as you're going through and looking at those types of things, to be priorities that you look at. Now, here's some things that I've actually seen and helped with directly. And one of the big pieces, especially in larger organizations, is the traditional IT and GIS and the clinical IT teams sometimes do not have the same goals, and don't always work together really well. And so I would say finding ways to find that common ground and understand that you're both out there to create the best outcomes for the patients, to create that business process and those things that need to happen. But sometimes how you want to go about it and get things done don't always align up. And so going in and talking and changing some of those processes and helping maybe the clinical IT to understand why you have the security concerns, instead of just saying, no, we can't do that project, that's not working for us. You give them some insight as to why there's concerns about the things that they want to bring in. Maybe it is things like it's not going to have the requirements for what needs to be patched, things like that, and help them understand that there are those risks to the actual patients if those devices don't stay updated and don't stay there. The other one that's huge, and this is before we ever get into the technical piece, is really making security everyone's responsibility. And I say this because this is, a basic thing, but when you think about, you walk into a room and there's an SD card or a USB key that's sticking out of a device, that whether it's a tech or a nurse or anybody that's in that environment should say that's not normal, and that's something that needs to be alerted to and brought up, because while those ports and things like that in most cases should be disabled if they're in a public space or in a patient accessible space, they're not always, right? And so making sure that that's alerted to somebody, that can be investigated against. But that is a behavioral change and something that really takes some thought leadership in having that shift happen. But then once we actually start talking about what technical things we can do. So one of the key pieces is actually limiting the blast radius. And so what I mean by that is using things like segmentation in VLANs and saying, okay, this is going to have a least privilege access. It's only going to have access to the ports and things that it needs, and it can only talk to the servers that it needs. Same thing is, if it needs to go outbound or any of those things, you want to limit where things can communicate to and from, so that if something was to happen, that would, not be able to go there. I actually really like the strategy of when you are bringing in some of those different IoT type pieces and you're doing third-party services, to go through some sort of a hosted platform, because you are limiting those devices communicating directly to your network, because they're going through that sanitization of that cloud-based resource when it goes through there, and then you're just getting the telemetry data coming in. And however you choose to ingest that and process it and bring it into your systems, that you can make sure a lot of times is going to be a lot more secure than all those devices going somewhere. So even if you are like creating and building your own IoT pieces, thinking about that of, almost using those IoT management and where everything ties into is kind of like a DMZ that you might have in a traditional networking setup, that's where everything comes in and is sanitized before it actually, the information needs to come over into your network. The other huge thing is patch management strategy and being able to talk about legacy OS machines. And so when you're talking to third parties and you're investigating new devices and things like that coming in, you want to be able to talk to them, okay, so how long are you going to do this? Or talk to me about responsible disclosure. What is your disclosure of if somebody or there's some sort of a patch that needs to go, do you have a corporate policy on how quickly you will notify us of those vulnerabilities in those devices? And those are now conversations that I would strongly encourage you to have. And if those companies don't have those strategies and don't have them in place, that's something that they probably need to work on too. But that's, again, that whole shared responsibility. You have to ask for those things. You need to bring those up, because we need to really holistically, add to what that does. And then the other big piece that if organizations put this in, and I've actually done this in a very large amount of healthcare pieces, is looking at the lateral traffic movement. That can tell you a lot of information. So unfortunately, especially when we're talking about in a data center and in your traditional IT structure, a lot of times once you get behind that core firewall, there's not a whole lot of controls on what goes where, and even inspection of the data. And so having some sort of a tool that can actually look at that east-west communication between machines and alert you if something weird is happening can be critical, especially in a healthcare environment with all the different machines and the noise and the signals. So creating, okay, hey, here's what normal looks like when we see something abnormal on that lateral movement, being able to alert to it very quickly. So those are some of the overall strategies in those areas there. Some of the, real quickly, the trend actual pieces that can help out with that. So we have our deep security, which is an actual tool that goes in, can do not only antivirus, but IDS, IPS, some application control, so unauthorized changes. The deep discovery and the tipping point is for a traditional networking piece, but that's that lateral movement. And then the tipping point is a very, very high speed IPS product, right? So being able to go through there and do that. And TX1 is something that you may not be aware of with Trend Micro, but that is a new joint venture that we've actually started. And those are hardware devices. And so they are designed to go on industrial IoT or also high-tech IoT pieces, but they are essentially purpose-built. They would go in place, and they're able to essentially kind of create a segment right there at that device. So if you have concerns of machines or devices that may not be able to update or are out of service from a patching cycle and things like that, but the ability to add those on and be able to still protect them, that is one option. And we're seeing a lot of those go in place. We're also seeing a lot of actual device manufacturers starting to look at those same types of options of building that into the device itself. And so that's on both sides of it, being able to go in there and put that in place. It can also be for things like the building automation in those areas too, all those controllers in those areas, putting those things in place to make sure that the facilities aren't being compromised. Those are all those areas that we're really seeing as some of those next points that attackers are starting to talk about online and try to go after. So those are some of those areas. The ability to look at emerging risks, malware, ransomware, unknown threats, those are all things that happen directly in the deep security product. It has the ability to, through application control, create your servers themselves can't be changed, they can't be modified, the configuration not going through there. And then the other big piece that we see a lot is that it actually is able to do file integrity monitoring as well as log inspection. So this is when you're going to like your security dashboards and things like that. You know, when you have that person that is going as fast as they can and they type their password in incorrectly 5 times, and normally that creates a security alert because they've been locked out and all those things, but they typed it in 5 times wrong in 1 minute. Now, if that same user had typed their password in incorrectly 100 times in 1 minute, that's what really should probably be popping up as far as a SOC dashboard versus a desktop support or somebody needing a password reset. So log inspection can help with things like that. I like to say it kind of helps to eliminate like the boy who cried wolf. It's making sure that what's actually showing up in security that needs action is actionable. And then the integrity monitoring, helping to make sure that things aren't being unauthorized changes and things like that. Also, which you may not be aware of, all these things that I'm talking about are actually coming directly through our research. This was last year, over 52% of the disclosed vulnerabilities that came out globally, Trend Research actually identified and contacted the software manufacturers about those. And so with that, the deep security piece can also kind of do some vulnerability mitigation by being able to do put in rule sets before you actually patch and give continuous protection. This also helps harden legacy operating systems that could be out there that you don't have the ability to patch. You're hoping to, possibly upgrade those and do that, but maybe they're attached to a medical device that has to use an old version of an operating system, and this allows you to be able to still use it and harden it, even though that there may not be patches available anymore. And the last couple things that I wanted to talk about were here in the world of, sometimes you can't do anything, you can't put anything in place. And with that, that's where I would say that lateral visibility, as well as looking at something like a actual tipping point, which would be a host-based or a network-based IPS, where you're making sure that you've segmented off that traffic and you're forcing it through. I would say in the world of COVID, one of the big areas that I would strongly recommend if you haven't is making sure that anything that's coming in through a VPN, because a lot of companies and hospitals and everything else has expanded out the VPN throughput that people are allowed to connect to. Make sure that that VPN traffic, you don't treat it as sanitized or safe. So that needs to be inspected some way, somehow, before you let it have access to the rest of your network. We have seen some issues with that, and while it may not have been as critical in the past, there's a lot more things where people may not be using the same devices that IT had control around 6 months later. That is something that's critical to look at and look into. So those are definitely some areas there to do that. And for the deep discovery piece, the reason I want to show that is this helps to be able to look at what's happening. So, this sits in the middle and we can see information coming from the different trend pieces. So like the network piece here with tipping point, or the deep security piece actually protecting servers and applications, or user protection that would be on like laptops and desktops and mobile devices, being able to go through there. And then deep discovery, when we see a threat, can do that and actually analyze it and create custom code to be able to actually protect it. But it can also sit and look at off of a core switch. We're able to actually look at and hang that off to the side and look at all the traffic passing through it. And that's where we can see that lateral movement. So being able to look at all of the internal communications inside of a network, be able to see if all of a sudden you have some sort of a clinical system that's wanting to talk directly to the payroll system. That's probably not something that you want to see happening on a really regular basis, because that shouldn't really be going back and forth through there, right? Those are all going to connect into servers, and that communication happens. So those types of things could be identified and be able to see that lateral pieces moving back and forth. So, when we talked about some of these that are here, the updatable firmware, responsible disclosure, documented time to update, making sure that they have some mitigation strategies and security on the devices, right? So when you're actually picking those things out, so, are they doing something like where Microsoft was just talking about of having that software actually in the device itself, where it can be secured and those things can be updated and done. There are some things out there that aren't. Those of us that are in the industry are really trying to help those IoT device manufacturers to understand putting in the ability to update, to be able to harden on the fly. Because when some vulnerability is found, the worst thing you could do is not be able to actually patch it or fix it. And then, in those rare cases that you can't, putting something like a TX1 out there to be able to do that. The last two, and you will have access to this with the presentation. We do have some overviews of how a healthcare provider was able to do some different data security and secure some stuff there in the cloud, as well as I found this really interesting. If you have time and you like to read about a lot of stuff, the full white paper on the securing connected hospitals is a really, really cool read. Talks about a lot of things that happen with our, that forward-looking team actually poses as threat actors, goes on the dark web, and so they're actually finding out things that are happening and giving us insights to help build these out. And if you don't have that, the executive brief is like 2-page PDF, but it gives a lot of great information and some great tips. So maybe if you want to share that out and bring those up to anybody else in your organizations, those are great tools as well. So thank you very much for the time. Hopefully you learned some things, maybe looked at the way that you're going to secure your devices a little bit differently in that strategy. And thank you for having me today, Ron.
Thank you very much. I think that was very insightful. One of the reasons why we've gotten such positive feedback about Trend Micro, why we at AngelMeet love working with them, is they understand the nature of IT security in general across all industries, as well as having specific expertise in healthcare.